Welcome to the Loveland Elementary School's reading of Toys, Amazing Stories Behind Some Great Inventions by Don Wolfson, illustrated by Lori Keller. This is the 2023 One School, One Book reading. Introduction. Play-Doh began as a product for cleaning wallpaper. The seesaw was first used as a prop in the bloody spectacle in the arenas of ancient Rome. Long ago, there were kites so large that people could be flown on them. Behind every toy, there is a story. But some toys have far stranger stories than others. Only those toys that had the most surprising and unbelievable origins are found in this book. Even though we know generally where and when a given toy was made, the chapters of this book are not in chronological order because there are all sorts of ways in which toys and their histories overlap. For example, tops have been around much longer than today's action figures, but action figures are a type of doll, and dolls were invented thousands of years before tops. So, really, there is no way to put the history of toys into a simplified order. In 1976, a time capsule was buried in Washington, D.C. Inside the capsule are dozens of toys from the last century. In 2076, exactly 100 years later, it will be opened. People will then marvel at the wonderful jumble of toys and see how we lived, how we dressed, and what we believed. Just as we are now, they will be amused and surprised by the toys they find, and from them try to better understand the past. The Slinky. It was a mistake, a goof-up, an invention that didn't work. A flop, that's what Slinky was, at least in the beginning. In 1945, an engineer by the name of Richard James was hard at work in a Philadelphia shipyard. The U.S. Navy had hired him to invent a stabilizing device for its ships. When a ship is plowing through the waves at sea, it pitches and plunges and rocks every which way. And its navigational instruments do too. Richard's job was to come up with something that would counterbalance the instruments so that they would be level at all times. Springs. Richard believed that some sort of arrangement of springs would do the trick. He tried all different types and sizes and put them together in every conceivable way. For weeks, he toiled making dozens of different devices, but none of them worked. In fact, he never did come up with the item the Navy had hired him to invent. But one day, Richard accidentally knocked a large experimental spring off a shelf. It should have just plopped on the floor. Instead, it walked down. Crawled, really, coil by coil, end over end. It descended onto a stack of books, then down to a desktop, down to a chair, and from there to the floor, where it gathered itself back together. He tried it again and again. Each time, the same thing happened. As soon as the workday was over, Richard hurried home. Fascinated with the strange spring, he showed his wife Betty what it could do. Together they tried it out in all sorts of ways and in all sorts of places. It was especially good at walking downstairs. A toy. Richard didn't think of it that way. Betty did. She was the one who realized that what her husband had invented was a terrific toy. Betty was also the one who named it. At first, all sorts of names came to mind, but none seemed quite right. For the next 2 days, she thumbed through a dictionary, keeping a list of some of the best possibilities. Finally, she came upon what she believed was the perfect word to describe the toy: Slinky. Early the next year, Betty and Richard James borrowed $500 to have 400 Slinkies made. They went from store to store, trying to get the owners to stock them. A few did, but despite Slinky's wonderful ability to walk, it didn't move off the shelves. Not a single one was bought. Richard and Betty were discouraged, but not about to give up. Slinky was a super toy, they were sure. And it would sell, but people needed to be shown what it could do. They went to the manager of a large department store named Gimbel's. It took a lot of talking, even a little begging, but finally they convinced the manager to let them put on a demonstration. Fearing the worst, Richard slipped $1 to a friend to make sure at least one Slinky would be sold. It turned out, though, that he had no need to worry. Shoppers stared in amazement as the steel coil gracefully walked down a sloped board. Within 90 minutes, the entire stock of 400 had been sold. Before long, Richard and Betty were able to start their own company. Within a few years, they were millionaires. As for Slinky, more than 352 million have been sold to date. Slinky's sales are as strong today as ever. In the world of toys, Slinky still walks the walk and shows no sign of slowing down. The early Slinkies were made of blue-black Swedish steel. In the first year of production, this material was replaced with less expensive American metal. The first Slinkies sold for $1 apiece. There are about 80 feet of wire in a standard size Slinky. During the Vietnam War, early 1960s to 1975, the Slinky reverted to its original role. First intended for military, Slinky the toy ended up on the battlefield. Carried by radio men in the jungles of Vietnam, Slinkies were tossed over high tree branches as makeshift antennas. Richard opened a shop in Clifton Heights, Pennsylvania, after developing a machine that can produce a new Slinky every few seconds. In 1960, Richard became an evangelical missionary in Bolivia. Slinkies make good scarecrows. After seeds have been planted, try hanging a Slinky on a nearby branch. With the slightest breeze, it'll dance around and birds will stay away. Perhaps Slinky's greatest accomplishment was in outer space. Bunches have gone aboard space shuttles. The purpose? To test the effects of zero gravity on springs. There are now plastic Slinkies, colored ones, those that look like walking rainbows, and others that light up. And then there's Slinky Dog, the classic pole toy. Susie, the Slinky Worm, and Loco, a Slinky Train. This is Mrs. Dowse. Thank you for reading with me.